You think medieval war was brutal? Try childbirth. No swords, no armies, just a woman alone, bleeding out on a flea-ridden straw mattress, while neighbors whispered about her odds of surviving the hour. No doctors, no anesthesia, just superstition, hot irons, and women screaming into cloth so the devil wouldn't hear. Picture giving birth in a candlelit chamber reeking of blood and burnt herbs, while a priest whispers prayers outside, not for your recovery, but for your soul. If you were lucky, your midwife had clean hands. If not, she packed your torn flesh with spiderwebs and holy water. Meanwhile, your husband prepared your funeral mass. 1 in 3 mothers didn't make it, and if your baby didn't cry, they baptized in urine. In the Middle Ages, childbirth wasn't a celebration. It was a death ritual in disguise. And what happened after birth? That's where the real horror begins. Medieval birthing chairs came with built-in restraints, leather straps, iron clasps, and wooden clamps designed to lock laboring women in place. These weren't your modern hospital bed safety features. These were full-on prisoner restraints. The chairs themselves were engineering marvels of medieval misery. Carved from solid oak or elm, they featured high backs, angled seats, and those charming drainage holes for blood and other fluids you definitely don't want pooling around your feet. Archaeological finds across Europe, from Nuremberg to Norwich, show remarkably consistent design features. Apparently, someone thought, you know what would make childbirth better? Prison furniture. The restraints weren't subtle either. Thick leather straps anchored arms and legs, while iron clasps locked around wrists and ankles. Some models even included wooden neck clamps, because apparently regular birth wasn't challenging enough without the threat of accidental strangulation. But here's the truly disturbing part. These restraints weren't for safety. They were to prevent women from escaping mid-labor. Yes, you read that correctly. Medieval medical texts explicitly state their purpose was to secure the reluctant mother and prevent flight during the crucial moment. Which raises the obvious question. If your patients keep trying to flee, maybe your methods need work. Records from the Hospital of St. Mary in York describe women being forcibly returned to birthing chairs after attempted escapes. One account details how 3 attendants were required to restore the unwilling mother to her proper position. Because nothing says, trust the natural process, like needing a security team for delivery. The chairs remained in use well into the 16th century, with some communities treating them as precious communal property. They'd pass from house to house, generation to generation, accumulating their own special kind of history. Think of it as a medieval version of hand-me-downs, except instead of clothes, it was blood-stained torture furniture. But before you judge the chairs too harshly, wait until you meet the people operating them. When your midwife's side hustle involves measuring people for coffins, a few restraints start to seem like the least of your worries. The woman delivering your baby often doubled as the village undertaker, because medieval career counselors apparently had a twisted sense of efficiency. Welcome to the world of medieval multitasking, where your birth attendant kept coffin measurements on file just in case. Isabella de Mortis of 14th century Canterbury embodied this morbid career combination perfectly. She charged 2 shillings for births, 3 for burials, and, because she understood market economics, offered convenient package deals. Her ledger books show she sometimes collected both fees in the same day. Talk about workplace efficiency. Court records from York paint an even grimmer picture. Midwife undertakers routinely took measurements for burial shrouds while performing prenatal checks. They carried dual-purpose bags containing both birthing supplies and burial linens, because nothing says confident medical care like bringing your own body bag to every delivery. These women weren't being pessimistic, they were being practical. With maternal mortality rates hovering around 25%, having backup plans was just good business. Archaeological evidence shows many midwife undertakers maintained workshops where they simultaneously stored swaddling clothes and coffin wood. One-stop shopping, medieval style. The arrangement created some fascinating conflicts of interest that medieval ethics committees somehow overlooked. Records show cases where midwives were accused of hastening the transition from birth to burial to secure both fees. Though most were acquitted, the fact that this was common enough to require legal precedent tells you everything you need to know about medieval healthcare. Some communities actually preferred this combination of roles. It streamlined the paperwork, for one thing. Plus, as one town council noted, she who brings forth life best understands its ending. Medieval logic at its finest. Most disturbing were the professional ledgers. Midwife undertakers kept detailed records comparing successful deliveries against profitable burials. Some even developed reputations for predictable outcomes, which customers apparently viewed as a feature, not a bug. But before you judge these enterprising professionals too harshly, consider their medical toolkit. When your only pain management option involved holy water and Latin chanting, having burial arrangements pre-planned was probably just being realistic. Medieval pain management during childbirth consisted entirely of priests sprinkling blessed water while muttering Latin prayers, because apparently divine intervention was more cost-effective than developing actual anesthesia. The church took pain management seriously, just not in any way that actually managed pain. The 1348 birthing benedictions of Brother Benedict laid out precise spiritual protocols: 17 Hail Marys for crowning, 23 for final delivery, and bonus rounds of prayer if things got particularly screamy, because nothing soothes excruciating pain like counting prayers. Monastery infirmaries were equipped with special holy water fonts positioned directly beside birthing areas. The idea was that closer proximity to blessed water meant better divine pain relief. Medieval logic at its finest. Some facilities even installed elaborate water dispensing systems to ensure continuous spiritual anesthesia during prolonged labors. The theory behind this approach was that pain was spiritually purifying. Women were expected to achieve transcendence through agony, a concept notably promoted by male clergy who would never experience childbirth themselves. Medical texts praised mothers who endured labor without complaint as blessed vessels of suffering. Those who screamed too much were considered spiritually weak. Midwives had to walk a delicate line between practical medical care and religious requirements. Court records show several were tried for heresy after suggesting that maybe, just maybe, some actual pain relief might be helpful. One Canterbury midwife was investigated for the radical act of offering laboring women warm compresses alongside their holy water. Some clever practitioners found workarounds. They'd bless herbs with mild numbing properties or sanctify wine as a primitive analgesic. These spiritual medicines let them provide basic pain relief while maintaining religious compliance, because sometimes you have to outsmart the system to help your patients. When holy water and prayers failed, which unsurprisingly was often, medieval medicine dropped the spiritual act and dove straight into nightmare territory. Because when all else failed, they didn't just give up, they brought out the dismembering hooks. In complicated deliveries, surgeons used specialized blades and hooks to dismember the fetus inside the womb, removing it piece by piece to save the mother's life. And no, this wasn't fringe practice, it was standard procedure. The 1363rd text extractive procedures by Master Hugh came with diagrams of skull-crushing tools and step-by-step dismemberment instructions. Archaeological finds from Paris's Hôtel Dieu Hospital include curved obstetric hooks, bone saws, and forceps that looked more like blacksmith gear than medical instruments, all precisely designed for their grim tasks. The worst part? These procedures were done without anesthesia. Mothers were fully conscious, while surgeons narrated each step like routine maintenance. Now extracting the left arm. Not horror fiction, just another day in a medieval delivery room. The technical skill required was impressive in a deeply unsettling way. Practitioners had to work essentially blind, relying on touch alone to identify and remove body parts without causing fatal damage to the mother. Training manuals included detailed sections on how to recognize different anatomical structures by feel, a medieval touch and tell that would give modern medical students nightmares. Most disturbing was the clinical detachment practitioners maintained. Medical records describe these procedures with the same emotional weight as treating a tooth cavity. One surgeon's log from 1375 notes simply, "Extracted deceased infant in 8 parts. Mother survived. Charged usual fee." Because apparently compartmentalizing extreme trauma was a medieval job requirement. The psychological impact on mothers was, predictably, completely ignored. Women who survived these procedures were expected to resume normal life immediately, perhaps with a few extra prayers for good measure. Medieval medicine had no concept of trauma counseling. Surviving was considered blessing enough. These extractions created fascinating legal complications. Was a dismembered fetus considered a person? Did burial rights apply to body parts removed separately? Medieval lawmakers addressed these questions with their usual combination of religious logic and practical brutality, creating rules that would make modern ethicists weep. Think medieval medicine was bad? Just wait, because they didn't stop at risky births. They built a thriving newborn marketplace on top of it. Medieval fathers legally owned their children, and yes, they could sell them before the umbilical cord was even cut. Picture this. You're still delivering the placenta, and your husband is negotiating the baby's price with a merchant. Totally legal. In fact, the 1285 Codex of Paternal Rights declared fathers had ownership from first breath to final breath, with full selling rights. Court records from 14th century Florence read like auction listings. Male infant, strong cry, 8 florins. Female, small but healthy, 3 florins, or 5 for 2. Girls were literally sold in bundles. Buyers often hovered outside delivery rooms, inspecting newborns mid-labor. Some even haggled based on how loudly the mother screamed. Prices favored boys, especially if they looked strong. Girls, often bundled as bonus items. Some fathers even had standing orders with rich families, baby subscriptions, medieval style. Sales contracts came with refund policies too. If the infant died within a week, buyers got partial credit. And yes, there were brokers. Professionals who connected sellers and buyers, arranged transport, and took commissions. Birth, death, and business, all in a day's work for medieval capitalism. The psychological impact on mothers was, predictably, completely ignored. Women were expected to hand over their newborns without complaint, often before even holding them. Resistance was considered a sign of dangerous maternal attachment that needed to be corrected. Some particularly industrious fathers turned childbirth into a proper business venture, maintaining breeding programs with multiple wives or concubines to ensure steady inventory. Because treating children like property never caused generational trauma or anything. And if you think selling babies before the cord was cut was efficient, wait until you hear what medieval societies did with the afterbirth. Because apparently the delivery room doubled as a kitchen. After giving birth, medieval women were expected to consume their own placenta, often prepared as stew with herbs and barley, because wasting perfectly good protein was apparently more disgusting than eating your own organs. This wasn't some fringe practice or cultural oddity. It was standard medical procedure. The 1347th cookbook, Nourishment for New Mothers, reads like a horror show recipe collection, featuring 17 different ways to prepare human placenta. There were simple broths for the squeamish, hearty stews for the practical, and, because medieval people never missed a chance to be extra, elaborate decorative pies complete with fancy crusts. Midwives came equipped for immediate placental cuisine. Their standard kit included specialized cookware, dried herbs, and detailed recipe cards. Picture delivering a baby and then immediately firing up a pot of placenta soup because apparently multitasking was a medieval requirement. The preparation methods were surprisingly sophisticated. Some recipes called for careful cleaning and sectioning, while others recommended grinding the organ into a paste with specific spices. Barley was a common addition, presumably to make eating your own organs feel more like a normal meal. Refusing to eat your placenta was once seen as dangerous vanity. Medical texts warned it could cause milk failure or lasting weakness, and some communities treated it as a moral duty. Wasting God-given sustenance was nearly sinful. Social pressure ran high. Families watched the mother's recovery meal, mixing support with scrutiny. In some regions, it even became a ritual, complete with prayers and ceremonial tools, because childbirth apparently needed an encore. Midwives kept meticulous notes, recipes, timing, health outcomes. Some became known for their placental cuisine, offering signature dishes and even preservation services for elite clients who wanted to savor it over time. The most disturbing part? They might have been onto something. Modern research suggests placental consumption can help with postpartum recovery, though maybe not in medieval stew form. But before you get too impressed with their accidental medical insight, remember these were the same people who thought bleeding patients cured fever. If you survived medieval childbirth, placenta rituals, and prayers as medicine, congratulations! You now qualified for postmortem surgery policies that made eating organs sound tame. C-sections were only performed on dead mothers. Why? Because no one thought women could survive having their abdomen cut open with unsterilized blades. In fact, it was illegal to perform a C-section on a living woman. The 1367th Manual Surgical Procedures for the Deceased by Master Giovanni treated it as a race against time, detailing how to extract a baby from a fresh corpse within minutes of death. Faster cuts meant better odds for the infant. Medieval hospitals took this grim task seriously. Archaeological digs at Santa Maria Nuova uncovered post-mortem cesarean rooms with custom tools and infant revival setups. They had the surgical skill. They had the instruments. They just never thought to use them on living women. C-sections in medieval times were so tied to death, they were literally called death cutting. If a woman requested one while still alive, she was considered mentally unstable, because wanting to survive childbirth via surgery? Clearly madness. This led to a brutal catch-22. If a mother had obstructed labor, doctors would wait for her to die before performing the surgery. Medieval medicine in action. We can do the procedure just as soon as you're dead. Medieval hospitals kept teams on standby, tools in hand, waiting for that exact moment a mother died. Start too soon? Moral outrage. Too late? The baby dies. Some surgeons performed hundreds of postmortem C-sections. They had the skills to save lives, just not the logic to try saving the mother. In some regions, even priests were trained to perform C-sections if no doctor was available. Because apparently hearing confessions wasn't enough, why not add emergency surgery to the list? Court records show heated debates over when the death cut could begin. Some pushed for immediate action. Others demanded definitive proof of death. And while they argued, lives hung in the balance. The tragedy? These surgeons were technically advanced. With even basic anesthesia and sterilization, they could have saved mothers. But instead, they waited for death, because medieval medicine was nothing if not brilliant and horrifying at the same time. Speaking of terrible medical decisions, their approach to newborn care was equally enlightened. If by enlightened you mean leaving babies outside overnight to see if they were worth keeping. Medieval communities routinely subjected newborns to exposure trials, leaving questionable infants outside overnight to determine their fitness for life, because natural selection apparently needed human assistance. These weren't isolated incidents or the actions of particularly cruel villages. The 1389th Protocols for Infant Assessment reads like a bureaucrat's guide to infant survival testing, complete with standardized procedures and recommended exposure times. Suspected weaklings were placed in designated areas outside village walls at sunset and retrieved at dawn, if they made it through the night. The archaeological evidence is chilling. Sites near Carcassonne have revealed dedicated infant exposure grounds, complete with tiny skeletal remains dating to the 14th century. The bones tell stories of systematic practice. Neat rows and organized deposits suggest this wasn't random abandonment, but an organized community activity. Medieval exposure trials were brutal tests for newborns, often triggered by birth defects, odd marks, or simply being born at the wrong time. In some areas, all twins were tested, based on the logic that one had to be weaker, because having two babies clearly wasn't difficult enough without turning it into a medieval survival game. Shockingly, this was seen as merciful, a kinder alternative to infanticide. The idea? Exposure gave babies a chance to live. Documents called it allowing God's will to manifest, a poetic way of saying, let's see if the cold kills them or not. Authorities justified it as resource management. Supporting disabled people was expensive, so communities created systems to filter out those deemed burdens. And the paperwork? Chillingly thorough. Survival odds in exposure trials varied. Summer babies had a better shot, but many villages made it harder on purpose, choosing remote or elevated sites to really test the child. And yes, there were laws. Who was liable if the baby survived but was injured? What if someone intervened? Villages had regulations, because if you're going to abandon infants, you might as well follow proper procedure. Even worse, some communities treated these trials like public events. Crowds gathered, bets were placed, infant exposure as medieval entertainment. Reform only came when the church stepped in, not over the cruelty, but over theological loopholes. Baptizing a baby, then leaving it to die? That raised spiritual red flags. Apparently, eternal souls mattered more than suffering infants. And if the baby survived all that? Welcome to the birthing stool. These wooden seats were passed down for generations, never cleaned, just shared like heirlooms, soaked in centuries of everything. Because nothing says, welcome to the world, like splinters and someone else's bodily fluids. Calling these things birthing stools is actually too generous. They were more like biological warfare stations disguised as furniture. Archaeological analysis of 14th century specimens from Bavarian villages reveals layers of biological matter from dozens of different users, accumulated like some horrific historical lasagna. These communal seats weren't just medical equipment. They were considered valuable village property. Families actually fought legal battles over birthing stool inheritance rights. Court records from 1372 show 3 families in Bremen engaging in a 2-year dispute over who had rightful claim to their village's primary birth seat, because apparently sharing contaminated furniture wasn't complicated enough without adding inheritance law. Village records show individual birthing stools in continuous use for over a century. The same piece of furniture that helped deliver your great-grandmother was now welcoming your baby into the world, along with whatever infectious companions it had collected along the way. Medieval communities tracked these stools' histories with disturbing pride, noting how many generations each had served, essentially keeping score of their disease vectors. The concept of cleaning medical equipment simply didn't exist. Even if someone had suggested wiping down the stool between uses, they'd probably have been accused of trying to wash away its accumulated wisdom. Some communities actually celebrated the darkened, stained wood as a sign of the stool's experience. That's right. The more contaminated it was, the more trustworthy they considered it. Women who suggested using new or private birthing stools were often viewed with suspicion. After all, if the communal stool was good enough for everyone else's grandmother, who were you to demand special treatment? This peer pressure to use contaminated equipment created perfect conditions for passing infections through entire communities. The most tragic part? These stools were often beautifully crafted pieces of furniture, carved with protective symbols and decorated with religious imagery. Medieval artisans put incredible skill into creating objects that would then spend centuries accumulating biological hazards. It's like they built shrine to cross-generational infection. This casual approach to medical hygiene wasn't unique to birthing stools. It reflected medieval attitudes toward maternal mortality in general. When dying in childbirth was so common that women planned their own funerals in advance, a little thing like sharing contaminated furniture probably seemed like the least of their worries. Speaking of which, let's talk about how medieval women approached pregnancy with all the optimism of someone planning their own funeral. Because that's exactly what they did. Pregnant medieval women routinely wrote detailed wills and planned elaborate funeral arrangements, because expecting to survive childbirth was considered dangerously naive optimism. This wasn't just morbid overthinking, it was standard practice. In 1378, the Testament templates for expectant mothers offered fill-in-the-blank death plans, complete with hymn suggestions and shrine donation ideas. Because apparently, planning your own death needed a manual. By 1396, records from Canterbury show that 847 pregnant women, about 60% of all pregnancies, completed detailed funeral plans. We're talking burial shrouds, pallbearers, guardians for surviving infants, and prepaid memorial masses to keep their souls in top-tier condition. Some wills were shockingly detailed. Margaret Blackwood of York specified how her hair should be arranged in her coffin and which dresses to donate. Agnes Fleming of Norwich even planned a funeral feast, with menus and seasonal backup options. Yes, really. Skipping these plans wasn't brave. It was seen as dangerously naive. With maternal mortality rates at 20 to 25%, death in childbirth was expected. Midwives coordinated with priests, making funeral prep a standard part of prenatal care. They were basically death doulas first, birth doulas second. Some women included multiple outcome plans if mother and child died. If just the mother died. If the mother lived. But hey, might as well save the funeral plan for later. The psychology behind this is both heartbreaking and practical. When childbirth was like playing Russian roulette with your life, planning your funeral was just good manners, a way to spare your family added grief while they dealt with a newborn. The most chilling part? These plans often had more detail than anything related to the birth itself. Because when your delivery room looked more like a torture chamber than a clinic, preparing for death wasn't pessimistic, it was just smart. Next time someone romanticizes medieval authenticity, remind them that natural childbirth once meant a 25% chance of death from infections we now cure with basic antibiotics. Medieval mothers faced restraint furniture, placenta dinners, and midwives who measured coffins as a side hustle. Modern complaints about hospital parking fees seem charmingly trivial when medieval women planned funerals as standard pregnancy preparation. Sometimes progress isn't revolutionary, it's just not dying from Tuesday.